Hi, my name is Emily Faerber, and today I will be summarizing my final paper, which discusses the exploration of complexities and challenges of traditional subsistence practices in Inupiat and Yupik communities of Alaska. So I wanted to start off with an overview of my presentation of why I chose this topic and why this topic is so important, and basically an introduction to my paper and how I kind of broke it down. The reason why I chose this topic was because in my anthropology class, this was actually one of the most fascinating topics to me, and I became very invested in it and took it to heart. I am someone who just moved from Germany, and so learning about indigenous Alaskan communities, which I had no prior knowledge of, and about how they conduct their subsistence practices, and it was just all very fascinating to me. It really makes you take a step back and have a lot more respect and admiration for culture. I think this topic is very important because it goes over the challenges that Inupiat and Yupik families are facing right now and how they have faced it in the past with subsistence practices. And I think especially living in Alaska, this is very important knowledge to have and know. As you can see on the right-hand side, I have a screenshot of my first two pages of my paper, and you can see that I basically straight away dive into climate change, as this is one of the biggest problems that is impacting subsistence practices currently. The way I decided to structure my paper was starting off with climate change and diving into this because it is one of the biggest things affecting subsistence practices. And then I proceed to talk about the history of subsistence practices because it's a good idea to get some background information about this history and cultural aspect of subsistence practices for those especially who don't know about this. I then discuss what is so important about traditional subsistence practices in the Yupik and Inupiat communities and proceed to go into detail about the multiple challenges that are affecting subsistence practices. So, as I just previously stated, I basically dive into climate change. So, what is climate change? Climate change basically refers to the long alteration of temperature and wind patterns, melting sea ice, changes in weather patterns, which are primarily a result of human activities or burning fossil fuels and a buildup of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. All of these things lead to changes in our environment and ecosystems. On the right-hand side, you can see two pictures. One showing how the greenhouse effect works on the top, and on the bottom picture, you can see a diagram of how different ecosystems and environments in these different regions in Alaska are being impacted by climate change. The result of climate change are having a huge impact on Alaska. I was reading an article by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and it basically talks about climate impacts in Alaska, and what was really fascinating to find out was that climate change is happening at a much faster rate in Alaska than any of the other states, because Alaska is located in the Arctic region. And what's happening in the Arctic region right now is that once the snow and ice melts, there's a lot more darker surfaces in the ocean that are exposed to the sun rays, which allows for more heat to be absorbed. Climate change is responsible for so many things, like melting glaciers, which is, you know, taking away that bright surface and leaving a lot more darker spots in the ocean. There's thawing of permafrost, there's coastal erosions, changes in wildlife is happening, like polar bears are losing their habitats because all of the sea ice is melting. They have nowhere to hunt anymore for food. It's getting a lot harder for them and a lot harsher in the winter times. There's also an increase in wildfires due to the temperature increases, and we also know that salmon are having a lot of issues because the water is getting a lot more warmer. In the two pictures on the left-hand side, you can see this being a result of erosion, which is basically damaging these infrastructures. And we see this in a lot of the communities, especially Inupiat and Yupik communities. Have experienced so much erosion in these remote areas, and it makes it so much harder to build houses and hospitals and schools, and many people are losing their homes because of this. So, what are subsistence practices? Subsistence practices in Alaska refer to the traditional ways in which Alaskan Native communities get food and other resources to survive, especially in harsh winters. Some of the key subsistence practices that we see happen in Inupiat and Yupik are fishing, salmon, halibut, or hunting caribou and moose. It also consists of gathering berries and other wild resources. Subsistence practices are deeply connected to Inupiat and Yupik communities. It's part of their culture and traditions, and it plays an important role in maintaining cultural identity and their values. These get passed down through generation to generation, and this is how they preserve their cultural heritage. It's not just the way to survive, but it's their special connection that they have to the land and sea. Many people also rely on subsistence practices to earn an income. They sell what they catch or what they create to earn a living. The Inupiat and Yupik tribes are very closely tied to the environment and understand how to ensure a long-term sustainability and how to take care of ecosystems around them, and they know how to balance harvesting limits and what they need to survive. They're so connected to the land and sea that they will know when something isn't right or something is wrong or migrating patterns are changing. It's because they're so spiritually connected to land, and it's just so beautiful to see. Here are two amazing pictures of the Inupiat communities going whaling, which is such an amazing thing to see. And the Inupiat believe that when they go whale hunting, the whale offers themselves to the people, and then in return, the Inupiat give a prayer of thanks out of respect to the animal. We saw this from one of our resources that we had from our anthropology class from the Inupiat whale hunt 2009. It was a YouTube video and it was such an amazing video. In the end, once they have gotten the whale and they bring it back on the ice, you can see the whole community coming together and cutting this up. And they try to do it as fast as they can to make sure it doesn't go bad, and they all work as a team, and it's just beautiful. You don't see this type of teamwork in urban areas. There's no sense of community. But seeing the whole Inupiat community come and work together and then have a feast afterwards, it's just so beautiful. It's such a great tradition. So, although Yupik and Inupiat are indigenous tribes of Alaska, they are very different in many ways, especially when it comes to subsistence practices. For instance, the Yupik relied more often on hunting, such as caribou, seal, fish like salmon, and they gathered berries and roots and other wild herbs and resources for food, and the Inupiat relied a lot more on fishing and whaling for most of their subsistence practices. And a lot of this has to come down with also the geographical location of where they were located. This is something I wanted to touch up on my paper, because even though I am talking about Yupik and Inupiat tribes, I want to specify that there are differences and that they are not just the same. One of the differences that I just mentioned were geographical locations. So Yupik are located towards the southwestern part of Alaska, and the Inupiat communities are located towards the northern and northwest part of Alaska. As I have also previously mentioned, subsistence practices are different. Yupik rely more on fishing and salmon, gathering wild resources, and hunting, while Inupiat heavily relied on fishing and whaling for subsistence practices. Their language is also different. So the Yupik, their language is part of the Eskimo language family, and the Inupiat language is part of the Inuit Yupik family. Both Yupik and Inupiat are known for their traditional arts and crafts. However, Yupiks are more known for their ivory carvings, and Inupiats are known for their skills in skin boats and parkas. Spiritual beliefs is also a very important thing I'd like to touch up on because there are differences. So as even though they are both spiritual, the Yupik believe in more of a complex system of spirits and gods, and the Inupiats believe more firmly in the spiritual connection with the land and sea. The houses are also very much different because the Yupik have more semi-subterranean gussets, and Inupiat live in more sod houses or structures called igloos. Some of the challenges impacting subsistence practices are, of course, climate change, which we've mentioned previously a couple of times, which affects the distribution of wildlife, fish, other resources. The weather patterns change, temperature increases, sea ice is melting, meaning the water becomes warmer because of the dark spots and the sun rays being soaked up in the darker spots of the ocean, and it's just causing all a big problem. Another thing is resource management and also legal challenges. So those who are responsible for regulations and restrictions and that impacts the hunting and fishing when the limit changes and people in these communities aren't able to hunt what they need because of these regulations. There's a lot of economical challenges as well. If subsistence practices drop, then some people will not be able to earn that income that they so heavily rely on. Cost of supplies in remote areas can also be high since you have to wait a long time for them to be shipped over, and it costs a lot more in these remote areas. The same thing goes for technological. So those who use snow machines, if something is breaking, and you need a replacement part, you have to wait for that and pay for that shipping, and it can be very costly. So regulations and policies. So I also in my paper go over the regulatory authorities, which recognize the importance of subsistence activities. So most of these, like ANILCA, for example, those laws, the federal state puts these laws in place, but they also take into consideration that the Inupiat and Yupik communities need subsistence practices in order to survive, especially in harsh winters when you need to be able to hunt those animals and not just live by harvest limits. Um, ANILCA is the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. These are responsible for harvest limits, enforcing regulations, and managing subsistence resources, and just protecting and making sure that there's a balance between what's being harvested and how many animals there are altogether. When looking at effectiveness of regulatory authorities, it's hard to say because there's a lot of views on this. ANILCA has helped make 100 million acres of land in Alaska into a conservation area. They also take indigenous communities into consideration. But however, on that note, there are some that argue that they don't take indigenous communities into consideration enough, that they don't listen to what they actually need, and that they're not meeting those needs. On April 10th, the Association of Village Council Presidents and the Tanana Chief Conference filed a lawsuit, actually, against the National Marine Fisheries Service because of the ineffectiveness of their regulations, because they're being outdated. The studies are outdated and the catch limits don't match with what they need currently. So one could argue that they are effective, but they definitely could be more effective in many ways. In my paper, I also go over the future prospects of subsistence in Alaska. For the future, it is unpredictable, especially with climate change. There's so many factors that you can't take into consideration. But there are things that you can do, like protect habitats, protect the environments that have those berries growing or the salmon, make sure that they're safe so you can prolong that Gaining more knowledge of traditional subsistence practices is also huge. Teaching others about this so that they're aware, and especially collaboration, working with others and learning about these things can make a huge impact for a better future for subsistence practices. I hope you guys enjoyed a quick summary of my presentation, and thank you for watching.